Hello and welcome back to the Nirvana special by the Mini Albums podcast by Zigentala, part 2. So, now we're going to be looking into the second album that they released, which would have been 2 years later. It's not their second album. We're going to be looking into the album they released next, which was In Utero. And that album came out 2 years later. So, just some simple album info. In Utero was the third and final studio album released by Nirvana 2 years later on September 21st, 1993 by DCG Records. Nirvana brought on Steve Albini, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, as a producer, and we're going to get into that and his influence on this album. It was also mastered by Bob Ludwig. In Utero did also reach number 1 a couple of weeks after its release in October and sold a total of 15 million copies worldwide. The album artwork was also executed and directed by the same as the Nevermind album, so Robert Fisher, the in-house creative director, obviously with influence and contributions by Kurt Cobain. And this album is sort of seen as more darker, more abrasive, and more explicit in regards to Nevermind. I feel like, as I said before, I see this album as sort of a creative reaction to the success of Nevermind, and you can see it throughout the process of how this was recorded and like the lyrics. I feel like the band really were trying to sort of shed this sound that made them famous, and a lot of that had to do with, the refinement of the mix of Nevermind, but also, all of this commercial exposure and success that they were getting. I feel like they were really trying to shed that and really go back to their roots, which is why I hear a lot of comparison between In Utero and Bleach, their debut album they released with Sub Pop before signing on to the larger record label. I don't know about you guys, but when I listen to In Utero, like, it seems really invasive to me. Like, some of the lyrics, they sound really personal. It's almost like, these lyrics are being read straight out of a journal. And I read somewhere that Kurt Cobain created a lot of the lyrics from the songs, they were like little snippets and pieces of poetry that he'd written over the last couple of years. But like, some of them are just, it feels almost violating. It's very gritty, and especially when you look retrospectively as this being the last album that Cobain created before he took his own life. When you look at the album, there seems to be there's this obsession with like rebirth, with human anatomy, and with like darkness. And the lyrics also sort of remind me of when you're in like a toilet of like some gritty, grungy bar, and all of the toilet walls are just little etchings that people have written when they're, obviously drunk and like inhibited. But it feels like that. It's just like, when you read some of that stuff, you're like, oh God, that's really like dark. But like, in that space, it's sort of like the only way that person can express those, whatever they write, like a confession or a lyric or something. I want to talk about Steve Albini's contribution to this album. And so Steve Albini was the producer. And I had a really, really, really weird moment when I was creating the notes for this podcast and I was researching him. It came up that he had died while I was researching a couple days ago. So he died of, I think it was a heart attack on the 7th of May. Right now, it's a week later, but that was a very weird and creepy moment I had when I was looking him up, that he'd just suddenly passed. But yeah, basically as a profile of him, so he is an American producer, an engineer, and a musician. He had a lot of strong opinions about the music industry, one of them being he didn't like to collect royalties from records that he'd produced or engineered because he thought that was an insult to the artist. He also preferred to be called an engineer rather than a producer. And we'll get into this later on. He was very much more so open to the band and what they wanted to do creatively rather than like what he saw as a producer. And he had very strong feelings towards the music industry, recording companies, the corporate side of the industry that exploited artists. When I was researching him, I have to admit, at first I judged him a little bit harshly because it just sounded like it sounded like those people that you sort of come across in a creative field that, everything needs to be done their way and their way only, and, they can come off as being quite hard to work with. But that was a very not good judgment, because while researching him, I actually came across a 4-page proposal that he actually typed up to Nirvana to propose like him producing the record. You can definitely look at this online. It's 4 pages. You can just look up Steve Albini 4-page proposal for In Utero Nirvana, and it'll come up and you can read the whole thing yourself. But like reading this proposal felt so pure, like the way that he talked about how he wanted to create a record for the band. He wanted minimal intervention from corporate. He wanted it all to be about the band, wanted to create the sound that the band wanted and what was the most authentic sound of, Nirvana. And here are a couple of excerpts that I really liked from the proposal. One was, quote, "I'm only interested in records that legitimately reflect the band's own perception of their music and existence. If you will commit yourselves to that as a tenet of the record methodology, then I will bust my ass for you. I'll work circles around you. I'll wrap your head with a ratchet." Another quote is, he likes to leave room for accidents and chaos. Making a seamless record where every note and syllable is in place and every bass drum is identical is no trick. Any idiot with the patience and the budget to allow such foolishness can do it. I prefer to work on records that aspire to greater things like originality, personality, and enthusiasm. So yeah, when I read this whole page proposal, I was quite inspired, because Albini seemed to really exude this ferocity in regards to creating music with integrity and in its most purest form, without intervention from record companies. And he did pitch that the band go to a secluded record studio and record the whole album there without any checks from executives, without any playthroughs, like just there, then record it all as authentic as possible. There was also a big emphasis on him being their guide rather than like someone that was going to control the project. He was very open to new ideas, new recording techniques, and he wanted to follow through with whatever the band would want to do. And I just feel like that's just quite admirable, especially when you look at the music industry today and how like a lot of songs and sounds and marketing ploys, they're also calculated because they're meant to produce an outcome rather than just creating art and music as a form of expression. I feel like it's also incredibly brave and so like badass, considering like the corporate pressure that Nirvana would have been on at this point. Like, you've just released an album that was huge. Like, the creative pressure on the band would have just been like, I don't even know if you would be able to explain it. And the fact that Albini's just like, we're just going to take what you guys want to do and we're just going to run with it. Like, yeah, it seems like Albini as a producer just was very against this sort of premeditated and heavily monitored form of art or form of music versus, the most purest form, which is just like natural and cathartic. And I think that if you listen to In Utero, there is a very cathartic quality about this album. The album took 2 weeks to create. It took 2 weeks to record. There was also references in his proposal that, a record shouldn't take more than like a week to produce. Otherwise, like, someone's getting fired. But yeah, so it was recorded over 2 weeks, minimal editing and minimal takes. One thing I really like about the album is that the majority of the recordings, the band actually just played together. They weren't in separate booths and they didn't do separate recording sessions, which I think is cool because you would just naturally have a different energy when you're playing with people, with your band, almost like live. And that's another thing Albini went into in his letter, being like he wants to capture the band as if it were live, capture like that full authenticity of the band. I've been listening to In Utero like passively in the background, and you can definitely hear like the space in the album. It's more like the Devonshire mixes from Nevermind. It's less polished. I think especially with Kurt Cobain's voice, when you hear him like scream in like songs like Milk It, it's almost like the space is like swallowing him up. And Kurt Cobain still uses a lot more of his talent with melodies, especially in songs like All Apologies and Heart-Shaped Box. But I think a lot of those melodies have also been traded in for more of this heaviness that Nirvana was trying to like own back. And it's just looking back at this album retrospectively, it does create this sort of invasiveness. Cobain, I think he took his life within a year after this album being released. But there are just some lyrics in there where you're just like, oh my God, like, was this a sign? Was this something that we had to listen to and think like, oh, is there something wrong? I mentioned this before. Cobain had like this obsession with anatomy, and that came out a lot in like the sort of darker part of the lyrics, like, references to an umbilical noose, or I wish I could eat your cancer in Heart-Shaped Box. I think the song Milk It as well has a lot of suicide references to it. Even just like the opening line, I am my own parasite. Or even in Scentless Apprentice, I lie in the soil, fertilize mushrooms. Just sort of referencing just rotting away. And a lot of psychologists, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, I can't say anything, but like there have been a couple that have sort of speculated that, the Cobain taking his own life was sort of on his mind then. And like even the fact that In Utero was actually meant to be named I Hate Myself and I Want to Die. Like Cobain actually wanted the album to be titled that, but then the label executives were like, absolutely not. So yeah, I think In Utero is definitely more harder, more abrasive, more weirdly violating. And this is a crazy thing that I found. And I feel like me discovering this makes me wonder whether like I'm living in the Matrix. And like, was this all pre-planned? Is this just like a story? Am I just like living in a story that someone is writing? And that is because, so when I looked into sort of research of like how like people were thinking that Cobain was like premeditative, like suicidal when he created this album, one piece of information that came up was that a psychologist had said that like this constant reference to like birth and death and rebirth like was a sign. And the very, very, very interesting thing is that so the band is called Nirvana, and they actually chose the name of this band because it directly defied all of the other band names that were coming out at the time of the grunge underground Seattle scene. It was all grungy, dirty names, and they wanted something that sounded pretty and nice, which is why they went with Nirvana. When you look at sort of the Western surface level understanding of Nirvana, it's happiness, it's this state of blissfulness, it's this state of great pleasure, sort of like a state of higher consciousness. But if you actually look at Nirvana as like a concept within Buddhism and Hinduism, I believe, it's actually a state that is reached when one extinguishes the fires of suffering, and those fires are attachment, aversion, and ignorance. But broadly speaking, Nirvana is like a state reached when you essentially extinguish the fire of desire, and that is because desire is the root of all suffering and attachment. And when you reach the state of nirvana, you actually get released from the constant state of death and rebirth and death and rebirth. And nirvana in like the native language, like I think it's called Sanskrit, is literally translated to being, is the translation of to be extinguished, to be blown out, you know? And to me, that's like insane when you look at that and just like the cross reference you can sort of see with like Nirvana as a band, as like the trajectory they went on, as Kurt Cobain, and like some of them are this, Kurt always had a fascination with birth and rebirth, and you can see that with, him. He originally wanted the album cover for Nevermind to be a water birth, because he was watching a program about births, like water births, and was really interested in that. And obviously label executives were like, that's a little bit too weird. We don't want that. You can also see Nevermind as the birth of the band, obviously the birth of the grunge Seattle scene into the mainstream media. And then In Utero as well, In Utero in itself is like a reference to, In Utero means to be in the uterus, so like pre-birth, and then the fact that the album cover also has this woman with like wings, and like the way that she's posed, I sort of see it as like it's almost like a holy figure, an angel figure. And so I've always wondered whether that also is like a reference to rebirth and to death. And also, I didn't really want to delve too much into Kurt Cobain's suicide note, because I just feel like it's a little bit too much of a touchy subject to get into. But one of the last lines on his suicide note was, "I don't have the passion anymore, and it's better to burn out than fade away." And like, I just feel like that's just so crazy. Just like knowing that he was part of a band called Nirvana, and Nirvana, like, directly translated in like the language that it spiritually comes from, literally means to burn out or to be extinguished, and means the release of one being constantly birthed and rebirthed. And like, you can see Nevermind as like obviously the birth of grunge in Seattle, but also like the death of the band in many ways. And then In Utero was also a rebirth of the band, reaching back to its roots, which was Bleach, reaching back to what it wanted to be, what it originally was. Like, when I found that out, my mind just exploded. Like, it's like I'm in a novel, like, and the author is just trying to be really smart with all of this. So yeah, that's In Utero. And so now we're going to be looking into what you guys had to say about these albums. Also, if you do want to be part of the conversation in the future and would like to share your opinion on these albums, definitely make sure to follow me on Instagram on @Zigentala, because I do ask you guys a lot of questions. I'd love to hear your input. Obviously, my opinion isn't the only one that matters, and I don't want it to be. It's very interesting sort of having conversations with you guys and what you think about, these albums. So basically what I did was I asked you guys what you preferred over In Utero or Nevermind, and these are a couple of the replies I got. Okay, one comment. In Utero is grunge in all of its dirty glory. Nevermind is the evolution of grunge into post-grunge. Both slap. Got someone that says In Utero because it's fucking disgusting and the pure embodiment of Kurt's mind. Someone says, Bleach is my favorite because I love their early work, but Nevermind will always rock hard. In Utero because Serve the Servants is the best opening to an album. Someone says, both fantastic, but I think In Utero was altogether darker, more real, and had superior writing. Someone says, In Utero, better producer, better sound, better sincerity. It is the real Nirvana sound. Someone says, Nevermind, because I have so many teenage memories with each of the songs here. Someone says, the rawness of In Utero and the Steve Albini factor wins this duel for me. Someone says they like Nevermind just because it's more nostalgic. Someone else says Nevermind because that's the album that made me discover every other artist that I like. Also a 10 out of 10. Someone says, Nevermind literally is the first album to introduce me to grunge. They have a very special place in my heart. No, someone says, Nevermind, but I've listened to it more so, and I prefer the production on Utero. But to me, the Nevermind track list is iconic, and hot take, Breed is the best song on there. And I'm getting a lot of Bleach fans coming through. I'm sorry. I didn't think that this would trigger all of you to come out of the woodwork. I'm sorry. Maybe I can look into Bleach in like a special episode where we look into like iconic debut or like underrated debut albums. Someone says they prefer In Utero because it seems like Nirvana's true soul is literally that album. Kurt's mind is fully in it. And yeah, I think that's why, as I keep on saying, I feel so violated when I listen to it. I feel like I'm like literally faced with like the deepest, darkest, gritty pieces of someone's mind. When art like that can impact you in that way, I mean, then that's great, because I mean, art is a form of expression. It's a form of communication. And for Cobain to sort of like be able to take people on that journey, I think is really talented. But also I'm a little bit conflicted because we're going to be looking later on into the price of fame and just sort of like what is good art worth if it means, you know, the destruction of the artist. But we're just going to look into a couple more of these. Someone says incesticide is actually the right answer. Someone says never mind because drain you. Someone says Nevermind and Nirvana are both overrated. They have 3 to 4 very good songs. Someone says In Utero, songs give me chills because Kurt committed suicide months after and the lyrics just make sense. Unfortunately, yeah. Someone says, oh, that's a tough one. I think Nevermind is a bit better on terms of tune, while In Utero is better lyrically. Nevermind is a lot cleaner sounding, unlike In Utero. I love both albums dearly since Nirvana means a lot to me, but I'd say Nevermind is more repeatable. Someone said Alice in Chains is better than Nirvana. Someone says Nevermind is chock full of bangers, but In Utero is sonically perfect and better album experience. And then we've got another one, Nevermind, because it's real, raw, and path-breaking. Feels like Nirvana has that hunger. And this is a comment on a reel. Something tells me Kurt did In Utero to ruffle some feathers. As much as I love Nevermind, there's just something about the vibe of In Utero that gets to me. And I always wondered if they were able to do another album after that, how it would have sounded. And that is crazy to me. I can't even, like, can you imagine if, or maybe the band might have broken up, who knows? But like, can you imagine what the next Nirvana album would have sounded like? I guess we'll always wonder that. Someone also says, both albums are amazing, but I do believe Nevermind is the slightly superior album. I believe better job at combining underground music qualities, for example, harsh vocals, yells, distortion, unorthodox guitar riffs with a mainstream appeal that regular music listeners can enjoy. I'm not saying In Utero doesn't have such qualities, but Nevermind accomplishes this just a bit better. If Nevermind is 10 out of 10, then In Utero is 9.5 out of 10. Another comment, I love both, but it's Nevermind for me. The album just flows better and the overall songs are better. The 4 singles they released aren't even the best songs on the album. One of my favourite moments in all of the music is when Territorial Pissing ends and Drain You begins. I could listen to it all day long. While some of the Devonshire mix tracks sounds better, others like Breed and Territorial Pissings just sound lost. The original that was released will always be, and still is to this day, the version I listen to, whether the band hated it or not. So yeah, that's what you guys had to say. There were so many replies, but I just tried to pick out the ones that were like really interesting and stuff. So yeah, thank you so much for your input. And that's what you had to say about the comparison of Nevermind and In Utero. And now we're going to get into the topic of today, and that is basically summarized in the price of fame. So obviously, the trajectory of Nirvana's career happened in such a small space of time. Well, if we're looking at something like from Nevermind, it was in the space of under 5 years. Like this band was catapulted into the stratosphere and was like one of the biggest bands in the world. And just like the trajectory that they went on and the fact that it ultimately resulted in tragedy. Unfortunately, it's something that still, I think, is very prevalent today in the music industry. There have also still always been musicians that have taken their own lives. What I want to talk about in regards to the price of fame is I want to talk about how fame sort of destroys authenticity. I want to look into the dangers of the tortured artist trope. And yes, look into sort of fame as a form of trauma and exploitation. So I want to talk about authenticity. I think authenticity is basically like this golden elixir that many artists and musicians need to have to be able to inspire the connection that they want with their listener base. And I think authenticity also attracts attention, it attracts curiosity, because when you are authentic and you are able to communicate that, you connect with people, and people are interested in you, and they're invested in you, and they're invested in what you have to say. And I think that ultimately fame destroys that authenticity. And you can even see it in the trajectory of like the Nirvana, in their career. They came from this anti-establishment, this anti-corporate counterculture, where it was all about doing things yourself. It was about this abrasive sound. It was about, screw the corporations. When you're still connected with that and surrounded by that, of course you're going to have that authenticity, but then when you get catapulted to such a level of fame where you ultimately get extracted away from that environment, and everything that sort of helped you be who you were and what your expression was is taken away from you. That's one of the things that really happened with Nirvana, is that they went from playing underground gigs, they went from being an underground Seattle sound, then to playing international gigs every night, to being on MTV, to, I'm sure being followed around a lot by paparazzi, or being on that same level as other international music acts that they probably didn't like, like mainstream musicians and artists. We see that a lot with a lot of artists, I feel. And not just even with musicians, but also you can see that with even with social media, people are very relatable and they're very authentic, and then they garner a big following, and then all of a sudden, they are this celebrity, they are this person, and they're not that relatable person anymore. I mean, obviously there are artists that can sort of get over that hill of still being able to be authentic, or at least present authentic to their audience once they've, accumulated so much fame and so much wealth. But I feel like it's a very huge internal conflict, especially if you're an artist or a musician that doesn't really want to compromise on who they are as a person. And I feel like Kurt Cobain definitely is in that category. Researching about how Nirvana was created and how In Utero was created, and how Kurt had all of these ideas and was very against, the compromising on his art, or compromising for a corporate measure. He didn't want to be censored. He didn't want his full expression to be censored. And I feel like that was a talent, because I feel like he was having all of these invasive thoughts and feelings, of suicide and stuff while he was writing In Utero, or even just the years before that. And it never was a question in his mind of whether that was something appropriate to write in a song, because he just did it. And most of who he was as an artist came from this pure creation of music and art and songwriting. There was no filter, there was no editing, there was no censoring of anything when it came to him. And I feel like when you get put in a situation where you're not in that same vein of where of your roots, so the underground grunge Seattle scene, I feel like that would create so much internal conflict, so much. And I feel like that's an impact that fame would have on an artist spiritually, when it comes to their authenticity, and it comes to their expression and who they are and who they came from and what they become, essentially, or what they have become. I feel like it does create sort of that dissonance in identity. And I think especially for someone as young as, Kurt Cobain was, which would have been 25, 26, 27, even then you still don't really have a full grasp on who you are and what you're doing, because your 20s, or at least I feel like I'm still in my 20s now, and it's just a catastrophe. And being put on the level of fame that Nirvana sort of reached with Nevermind would just have so many implications spiritually, artistically, authentically, 100%. And another thing I want to look into is this really sort of glamourized, tortured artist trope, which I think has a lot of implications to it. And I feel like this is a trope that's sort of been used throughout history. And I want to specifically reference the 27 Club, which, if you don't know, the 27 Club is basically a group of musicians that have died at the age of 27. For example, Kurt Cobain is part of the 27 Club. You also have Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Amy Winehouse, and many more. But those are probably like the top names in the 27 Club. So basically, people that have perished at 27, they're usually people that have showed very promising careers in their fields because they are extremely talented and just seem to be very promising artists. And they all end up dying at a very young age. And a lot of them usually are somehow entwined with like substance abuse, substance addiction. And I've always had this fascination with the 27 Club, not because I think it's something admirable, but just because, I don't know, I think it's this example of, you know, the pursuit of art, the pursuit of good art and the pursuit of talent and the pursuit of ambition sometimes can literally be the end of you. And it's not to say that these artists or Kurt Cobain wanted the fame or wanted to reach great ambitions, but it's just sort of like, I feel like you can get caught in that process, and like there are so many things that sort of impact you. And I think we are coming into an age where we're sort of starting to understand that fame is a type of trauma. And there's lots of factors that play into it, you know, when you think of like the exploitation and the demand of the music industry, which can be really grueling with touring and recording and press releases, constant traveling, you know, pushing your body to its limit. The invasion of privacy would have so many impacts, you know, and can result in things like depression and anxiety, sleep deprivation, you know. And then obviously when you are famous and you're part of this elite group, accessibility to illicit substances is very easy. And what it can do is it can promote using these substances as a temporary fix or as a ways to deal with the demand of fame and to deal with the exploitation and the trauma of fame. And I think also, especially like in this day and age, we're very aware of mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, autism. We're very aware of sort of minds that can be put on the spectrum. And I feel like even back in the 90s, it wasn't a thing. So even a lot of these artists, I'm not really quite sure what Kurt Cobain suffered from. I know that he did suffer from depression, or that's what people say. I'm sure there are also a multitude of artists that are somewhere on the neurodivergent spectrum that never got the care or the support that they needed, especially when neurodivergence does go hand in hand with having a unique creative caliber. It wouldn't surprise me if a lot of artists that are particularly creative and artistically talented and gifted actually fall on the spectrum. And then that would make it all the much more harder to deal with things that even neurotypical people would find hard to deal with, such as, a very tough schedule and a very demanding career. And just another example that we're going to look at from the 27 Club is Amy Winehouse. If you didn't know, there was a documentary that came out in 2015 called Amy, and when I watched this, it was completely heart-wrenching and basically just showed, obviously, Amy Winehouse's career and her trajectory, but then also showed like a lot of the signs that were there to do with like her substance abuse and her alcoholism, and just a lot of signs that were overlooked and not taken seriously. And, you know, even when you think of the hit Rehab, which became massive, you know, it was a hit, it was a moneymaker, it was pulling in the figures that the labels probably wanted, but like there was nothing else that was questioned about that, you know, or how she's dealing with everything. And you know, it sort of begs the question of like, should there have been some sort of intervention, you know? Or even when we listen to In Utero, a lot of people say that, you know, it's very lyrically and poetically dark and it's so raw and it really just shows us an insight into Kurt Cobain's mind. But then it's also, on the other end, you have to wonder just like how much more care was needed in that situation It just questions sort of what intervention should have happened. If it meant saving someone's life or giving them the help and the support that they needed. One of the things that really sort of shields artists from really getting the inquiries of, are they okay? Is this all right? Is like that shield of the rock and roll image. Artists are meant to be sensitive. Artists are meant to be they're meant to be very expressive, and, it's just in their nature. It's not something that we need to look into too specifically. And it just begs, again, that question of what is the cost of good art and creating good art and producing good music? Is it worth the expense of the artist? Another example I can think of that isn't part of the 27 Club, but is, someone that is known throughout history as being a massive influence in art, and that's Vincent van Gogh. I'm sure he wasn't diagnosed in the time that he lived, but a lot of people have speculated that he had bipolar disorder, that he suffered from psychotic episodes, he suffered from depression as well, and that was all magnified through lifestyle choices like malnutrition, overworking, having insomnia, and substance abuse. And even though Van Gogh created, some of the most influential art that is still known today, even in his particular situation, obviously he wasn't affected by fame, but it's also that, again, that sort of tortured artist trope that we sort of accept. We're like, oh, if he wasn't the way he was, we wouldn't have got this amazing art. But then what is the ethics of that? What validates good art at the expense and the destruction of the artist itself? So yeah, I think fame and the way that artists and musicians are treated is a greater criticism of the music industry. And since, Kurt Cobain took his life, we've had also a string of other musicians that have done the same. Examples would be Chris Cornell from Soundgarden and Chester Bennington from Linkin Park, who both committed suicide in 2017. We've got Avicii, who took his life in 2018, and then we also have Keith Flint from The Prodigy, who took his life in 2019. Or it's speculated. I don't know if it's full proof, but I think it was suicide. But yeah, all of these amazing artists that you would perceive to be, at the top of their career, and a lot of them are suffering mental health issues, and it's not all that it's panned out to be, this being famous and this rock and roll image and having a successful music career. And as I keep on going back to, it really begs the question of what is good art worth? What is good music worth? Is it worth the torture and the psychological destruction and impact of a human being? Is it worth that? I think we've come a long way to see what fame is, and we're starting to understand it more on a psychological level, and we're starting to understand how people should have a good support network and they should be getting the care that they need, mentally and physically. But I also feel like we're entering a completely different realm now with the rise of social media and this whole new aspect to parasocial relationships and this whole new aspect to sharing your life and your things that would otherwise have been private online. So yeah, that's, I think, obviously what happened to Kurt Cobain was incredibly tragic and it shouldn't have happened. It's a cautionary tale because I feel like there are a lot of artists and musicians that would want and strive to be everything that Nirvana achieved, to be one of the most famous and impactful bands in history, to have one of the most famous and impactful albums ever. But unfortunately, what is it worth? It really just shows the cracks in this very glossy, glamourized lifestyle of being a musician and traveling the world and doing gigs and doing press releases and having all of this wealth and exposure, but to what means, to what is it worth if it means the destruction of one's life? Yeah, so that's it. That is the Nirvana special episode. Done. It was a whopper of an episode to do. I can feel my throat. I can really feel like my throat getting a little crackly because I have been like yelling into this microphone for 2 hours now. That's Nevermind. That's in Utero, and that is the topic, the price of fame. Thank you so much for listening. If you're listening on a podcast host, please, please, please give my podcast a rating. And if you are watching on YouTube, make sure to like leave a comment. Tell me what you think about, anything that I've just talked about. Definitely make sure to follow me on all social medias as well. My handle is @Zigentala. That's @Zigentala. Definitely follow me on Instagram because I'll keep you up to date on episodes that are coming out and what albums I'm going to be doing next. I really like this 2-album structure where I sort of compare 2 albums. I think there's like more conversations to have because you guys seem to be very vocal on what's a good album and what's not a good album, especially, the diehard fans. So I'll definitely look into doing that in the future. But until then, thank you very much for listening. Good day, good night, have a good one, and I will see you in the next ep. Ciao.